Chapter 9, Oldham. Well, we've got a special panel together tonight to discuss race and multiculturalism in Britain. I'm joined in the studio by Tariq Ahmad and Lee Dixon, both residents of Oldham 10 years ago and now, and Lord Ahmed, a Conservative peer, Paul Thomas, an academic who's researched extensively in Oldham since the riots, and Munira Mirza, the Arts and Culture Advisor to the Greater London Authority, who's also from Oldham. Right. Lord Ahmed, here we are, and we're at a junction where David Cameron is saying that really, you know, there's a problem with multiculturalism and there has to be cohesion. And here we have a government which has followed on from the last government's position of encouraging faith schools. Isn't there an irony there that actually by encouraging faith schools and free schools, what you're encouraging is more separation?
Well, I think, first of all, let's put it into context, the basis of why the riots happened. I think the point's been made about economic deprivation, social mobility, and education is a key way of addressing it.
Absolutely.
And if you look at faith schools, let's look at it again from a historical perspective. The church schools provided church education or state education when perhaps the state sector itself were not there. So there's a legacy issue. I mean, I myself went to a church school. I went to a school called Holy Trinity. That didn't suddenly make me less of a Muslim and more of a Christian, but it taught me a very basic understanding of other faiths, and I think that's what should underline any faith school. Well,
let's talk about that then. Yeah. So should there be a requirement then of a faith school to have a minimum proportion of children not from the predominant faith of the school?
Well, the thing is, these setting of quotas, etc., is, I think, less important. More, I would actually...
But wait a minute, unless you actually force the issue with some kind of social engineering, how are you, for the vast majority, going to end the idea of parallel lives? Because that is what the Cantley report said. People are living parallel lives.
That was Ted Cantle's, and Professor Cantle is someone I know well, I respect. But let's, again, look at Britain as a whole. Evolution has happened over time, and we've seen people of all communities, of all faiths, actually identifying themselves as strongly British. The fact that you may be Muslim, Hindu, or of other faiths should not matter in identifying yourself as British. And just picking up your point on education, if I may, it's not the setting of the quota of numbers, it's what is being taught in those schools. If those schools, whatever faith school they may be, teach about other religions and humanism as well, you bring forward a very balanced perspective on the children you're actually educating.
Mayor, do you recognise this picture?
I think the problem that's happened in places like Oldham is that there's been too much kind of heavy-handed interference in trying to socially engineer. And what's interesting about the Waterhead Academy and some of the more recent initiatives that Oldham's taken up is that they're trying to create schools which are just good schools and bringing people together from different communities and improving educational opportunities. Now, they're trying to bring people together around a shared vision rather than trying to change their attitudes directly. They've got much more of a positive approach, which I think is the way to tackle these issues.
Well, interesting, we're talking 10
years. Quite new.
Yeah, exactly, these issues are. You're talking 10 years since the riots. A whole load of kids have gone right through secondary school since those riots, come out the other end, and are still leading separate lives.
Well,
that's because policies in Oldham, they've also changed quite a lot in the last 10 years.
And I think the issue, I mean, there was hope in that film that we just saw as well. I mean, you asked Lee the question about political engagement. I think there was great hope in the fact that the BNP's support is declining. Issues around race, immigration are pertinent questions to ask, and there are sensible discussions to be had, and I agree with Munira. This is not about social engineering, it's about bringing communities together, recognising differences and celebrating those differences, but actually saying there are things that unite us.
But you bring communities together, but it is true, isn't it, that many areas in Oldham are actually separated housing-wise, that you have predominantly white areas and predominantly Asian areas.
Yeah, without a doubt, yeah.
And what do you think of the idea of actually that if there was more mixing in a community in terms of living side by side, that would organically mean change?
Obviously it would, that'd help a lot, but I think it's too late for that, I think, because it's already gone past the stage where people know the boundaries. So there's no...
But Lee, there's also this thing about bringing two communities together. I mean, if you're a neighbour and you have, say, an Asian neighbour, I think one of the best things you can actually do is extend the hands both ways. And if you come together that way, and the onus is on all communities to do just that.
Paul, it doesn't happen, does it?
No, I think it is happening, but I think it has to be done slowly and in safe ways. The youth activities that I've seen have created safe spaces where young people can get to know each other as individuals, not as Asian or white, but as a person with interests, and they find out what they've got in common. And when we do this, I appreciate it's slow, but then maybe they will think about living together or socialising together. But with the best will in the world,
it's a youth centre or two. We're talking about a whole generation of children growing up, by and large, separate by colour and religion from each other in a single small town.
I think it's important to sort of point out that the biggest form of segregation in Britain is actually social class segregation. So where people live is one facet. How are we giving people the opportunities to mix together in quality education and to have quality employment experiences? I totally understand why some of those white young people are very angry, just as many young Muslim young people are angry because Oldham as a town has been let down. New types of jobs haven't developed in many towns like Oldham, and that's why you've still got tensions in towns like that.
But that is not going to change. We know about the history of mill towns in the north, that it's not a very happy one in terms of generation of new employment. In the end, does it matter if people live apart, live separately?
I don't think it really matters too much. I mean, you can't force people to live together. I think change will happen. It's happening not at the pace in terms of what people want, but I think the change is happening, that transition is taking place. We can't force people to live together. Like I said before, you can't expect people to live in totally white Asian areas or totally white areas. I think that change is going to happen slowly but surely, and evidence of that is already starting to happen.
But of course, multiculturalism isn't antithetical to social cohesion, is it? I mean, do you believe actually that multiculturalism will survive as a policy?
I think it will survive.
No, I think you have to make a distinction between multiculturalism as a kind of lived reality, the fact that Britain is a diverse place, there are lots of cultures, migrants. I mean, that's a very positive thing. I'm very pleased about that. I want to live in that kind of country. But then there's state multiculturalism, which is the policies, the practices, the emphasis on difference, the institutionalising of community groups, unelected community
so in fact,
leaders,
you actually don't want to see
that
things like policy that has a particular pot of money for one ethnic group as opposed to a particular pot of money to another ethnic group.
And in a sense, that did happen in Oldham before the riots. That was one of the triggers to the tension. And I do think it's an issue that there are parts of the country where people just don't want to go into other areas, that they don't want to send their children to schools with other ethnicities, and so that it's not to underplay that problem.
Do you think that white working class people feel discriminated against now?
Yeah, definitely. Without a doubt, to be honest. They see it as one area of Oldham getting preferential treatment to another area.
And can you actually see that actually physically buildings or initiatives don't happen in your area?
Before the riots and probably afterwards, yeah, you can see it. Just by examples of like football pitches, children's play areas, schools, new housing development, stuff like that.
But it is a desperate situation, isn't it, where people feel dispossessed, that they don't feel comfortable in their own towns?
Yeah, I think that the broader national picture is important, because you can't just blame Oldham Council or the agencies that are in a single town for what's happening. There is a broader narrative about inequality in this country, which is still framed in terms of race.
Yeah, we need to talk about social class as well, and poverty.
Out of date. Things have changed a huge amount.
Economic and social mobility are the key factors.
Thank you all very much indeed.